You are sitting in a conversation that suddenly becomes uncomfortable. Someone asks a question you never expected to hear. Did Moses really part the Red Sea? The room goes quiet for a second because everyone understands that the question is larger than geography, archaeology, or ancient history. It is really a question about how people decide what is true. Maybe you grew up hearing the story so many times that it became part of the background noise of your life. Maybe you rejected it years ago because it sounded impossible. Either way, something interesting happened long before you ever formed an opinion. Your conclusion was already being shaped by the people around you. That realization is far more unsettling than the question itself. Most of us imagine that our beliefs are products of careful thinking. In reality, they are often products of familiarity. The human brain is remarkably efficient at accepting what feels normal. If everyone you trust repeats the same story throughout your childhood, your mind rarely pauses to ask whether it is historically established, symbolically meaningful, theologically true, or some combination of all three. It simply becomes part of the furniture of reality. The opposite is also true. If everyone around you treats ancient miracle stories as obvious myths, skepticism begins to feel equally natural. Neither reaction automatically tells us anything about what actually happened thousands of years ago. They tell us something about ourselves. Imagine two children growing up on opposite sides of the world. One hears the Exodus story as a defining moment of divine intervention. The other hears it as an example of legendary storytelling from the ancient Near East. Years later, each believes they reached an independent conclusion, yet both may have inherited the emotional atmosphere surrounding the story long before they ever examined the evidence. That does not mean either person is dishonest. It means human beings are social creatures before they are independent thinkers. We absorb assumptions before we analyze them. That pattern extends far beyond religion. It influences politics, science, culture, and even the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. When people ask whether Moses really parted the Red Sea, they often imagine there are only two possible answers. Either every detail happened exactly as described, or nothing meaningful happened at all. Reality is often less comfortable than either extreme. Historians, archaeologists, biblical scholars, and theologians approach the question with different methods and different goals. A historian asks what can be established using surviving evidence, contemporary sources, and historical reasoning. A theologian may ask what the narrative communicates about the relationship between humanity and God. A literary scholar may focus on symbolism, structure, and meaning within the text. These approaches overlap at times, but they are not identical. Confusing them creates unnecessary conflict. Historical investigation operates with limitations. Ancient events rarely leave behind complete records. Even significant battles sometimes disappear into silence, surviving only through fragmentary accounts. Expecting modern levels of documentation from the ancient world often leads to disappointment. At the same time, the absence of decisive archaeological confirmation is not identical to proof that something never happened. History is filled with events that remain uncertain because evidence simply did not survive. Honest inquiry requires becoming comfortable with uncertainty instead of rushing toward absolute certainty. The biblical account describes the Israelites escaping Egyptian pursuit through waters that part before them, before closing again over the pursuing army. For centuries, readers have debated details that many people assume are settled. Which body of water is actually being described? The traditional English expression Red Sea comes from translation history, but many scholars note that the underlying Hebrew phrase is often understood as Sea of Reeds. That possibility has generated discussions about marshlands, shallow lakes, lagoons, or regions whose geography has changed dramatically over thousands of years. Ancient coastlines shifted, rivers changed course, sediment accumulated. Areas that once held water may now look entirely different. Geography itself refuses to remain frozen. Some researchers have explored whether unusual natural events could explain parts of the narrative. Strong sustained winds have been shown in computer models to temporarily expose sections of shallow water under specific conditions. Coastal phenomena, tidal interactions, and weather patterns sometimes produce dramatic effects that surprise even modern observers. Such studies do not prove that the Exodus account happened exactly this way. They simply demonstrate that nature occasionally behaves in ways people would not ordinarily expect. Others argue that these natural explanations fail to account for important features of the biblical narrative or rely on speculative reconstructions. Still others maintain that if the event occurred through direct divine action, searching for an entirely natural mechanism misunderstands the claim from the beginning. The debate continues because the evidence does not force everyone toward the same conclusion. That can feel frustrating if you want certainty, but uncertainty is often where serious thinking begins. Psychology adds another layer. Human beings have a deep desire for stories that reinforce identity. Communities survive by sharing narratives that explain who they are, where they came from, and why their lives matter. The Exodus story became one of the defining identity narratives of ancient Israel. Whether someone approaches it primarily as history, theology, or both, its influence on Jewish and Christian thought is undeniable. That influence itself does not verify every historical detail, but neither does it make the story insignificant. Identity-forming stories possess extraordinary power precisely because they shape generations of people. Sometimes they preserve historical memories. Sometimes they emphasize theological meaning. Sometimes they do both simultaneously. Modern readers often expect ancient texts to function like contemporary documentaries. Ancient authors frequently wrote with different priorities. They sought to preserve memory, communicate meaning, and interpret events within a worldview where divine action was understood as part of history rather than separate from it. Reading such texts responsibly requires recognizing those literary and cultural differences without assuming that every ancient narrative must therefore be fictional, or that every detail must be interpreted in only one way. Both extremes oversimplify a far more complex reality. Confirmation bias quietly enters the conversation. If you already believe miracles cannot occur under any circumstances, every possible explanation will eventually become naturalistic, even when important questions remain unanswered. If you already believe every biblical event occurred exactly as described in every detail, contrary evidence may feel threatening rather than informative. In both cases, the mind often protects identity before evaluating facts. This is not unique to religion. It happens in every area where belief becomes tied to belonging. The more closely an idea becomes connected to your sense of self, the more difficult it becomes to evaluate that idea objectively. Losing an argument begins to feel like losing yourself. That emotional cost explains why conversations about religion become intensely personal so quickly. They are rarely just debates about evidence. They are debates about family, memory, community, purpose, and hope. Consider how easily confidence can be mistaken for evidence. Someone may speak with absolute certainty that the crossing unquestionably happened exactly as written. Another may express equal certainty that it is impossible. Their confidence tells you something about their conviction, not necessarily about the strength of their evidence. Human beings consistently overestimate how much they know. We remember conclusions more clearly than the reasoning that produced them. We often inherit certainty second-hand. It feels solid because it has been repeated, not because we personally investigated it. That realization is uncomfortable because it forces humility. Humility is difficult precisely because certainty feels emotionally safer. The deeper question hidden beneath the story concerns what we expect history to deliver. Many people imagine that historical investigation should remove every doubt. In reality, history often narrows possibilities rather than eliminating them. Ancient history especially operates through probabilities, competing interpretations, incomplete evidence, and careful reconstruction. Scholars frequently agree on some points while disagreeing strongly on others. That disagreement should not automatically be interpreted as weakness. It reflects the complexity of studying events separated from us by thousands of years. The desire for absolute answers is understandable, but reality does not always cooperate with that desire. Perhaps the most revealing moment comes when you notice your emotional reaction. Does the possibility that the event might not be historically demonstrable make you anxious because it feels like a threat to your faith? Or does the possibility that extraordinary events might have occurred make you uncomfortable because it challenges your assumptions about reality. Those reactions deserve attention. They reveal how much identity influences interpretation. Sometimes the most important discovery is not about Moses at all. It is about yourself. Independent thinking begins when you become willing to examine why certain conclusions feel emotionally necessary. That willingness does not require abandoning faith or embracing skepticism. It requires intellectual honesty. Honest inquiry is slower than certainty. It asks better questions before demanding final answers. It recognizes that sincere people can examine the same evidence and reach different conclusions without automatically acting in bad faith. That does not mean every conclusion is equally persuasive. It means serious investigation respects complexity instead of pretending difficult questions have effortless answers. Perhaps that is why the story continues to fascinate people across cultures and centuries. Whether approached as sacred history, theological proclamation, literary masterpiece, or historical puzzle, it forces us to confront how we evaluate extraordinary claims. It reminds us that evidence matters, but so do assumptions. Facts matter, but so does interpretation. History matters, but so does the lens through which we read it. The uncomfortable truth is that most of us spend far more time defending inherited conclusions than examining the foundations beneath them. Asking whether Moses really parted the Red Sea ultimately becomes an invitation to examine something even more personal. What standards do you use when deciding what is true, and do you apply those standards consistently, even when the answer challenges the beliefs that have become part of your identity? If conversations like this matter to you because they encourage thoughtful questioning instead of comfortable assumptions, consider subscribing and continuing to explore ideas with the same willingness to examine both the evidence and yourself. There is another reason this question refuses to disappear, and it has very little to do with the Red Sea itself. Human beings are uncomfortable with the possibility that history may never answer every question we ask. We want closure. We want a discovery that settles the debate forever. We imagine archaeologists uncovering a single artifact that forces everyone to agree. We picture one undeniable inscription, one perfectly preserved document, one dramatic piece of evidence that removes every doubt. That desire is understandable because uncertainty is psychologically exhausting. Our brains constantly search for stable patterns. Ambiguity consumes mental energy. It is much easier to live inside certainty than inside probability. Yet almost every field that studies the ancient world teaches the opposite lesson. The farther we travel into the past, the more we learn to distinguish between what is well established, what is plausible, what is possible, and what remains unknown. That distinction is not weakness. It is intellectual discipline. The temptation to erase those categories is powerful because uncertainty feels like vulnerability. Throughout history, civilizations have preserved memories in different ways. Modern societies leave behind digital archives, photographs, satellite imagery, government databases, and countless written records. Ancient societies relied heavily on oral tradition, long before many stories were written down. That does not automatically make those traditions unreliable. Oral cultures often developed sophisticated methods for preserving important narratives across generations. At the same time, oral transmission is not identical to a video recording. Stories can become structured, emphasized, condensed, or expanded to communicate meaning as well as memory. Understanding this reality helps explain why scholars devote enormous attention to literary patterns, repeated motifs, and cultural context, rather than assuming ancient texts function exactly like modern historical reports. The Exodus narrative itself has shaped civilizations regardless of how individual readers evaluate its historical details. It inspired people living under oppression. It influenced legal traditions, literature, music, political speeches, and movements seeking freedom. Enslaved communities throughout history often identified deeply with the image of liberation from bondage. That influence is historically undeniable, even while debates continue about reconstructing every event behind the narrative. This raises an interesting philosophical question. Can a story possess immense historical influence, even if historians continue debating aspects of its historical origin? The answer is clearly yes. Many foundational narratives have transformed cultures regardless of ongoing scholarly discussions about their earliest forms. Influence and historical reconstruction are related questions, but they are not identical questions. This distinction often disappears in public debate because people instinctively collapse multiple conversations into one. Another psychological force enters quietly at this point: the fear of changing our minds. Most people imagine that changing your opinion happens through a dramatic moment of revelation. In reality, it is usually much slower. Small questions accumulate over time. A detail that once seemed insignificant becomes difficult to ignore. A book introduces a perspective you had never considered. A conversation exposes an assumption you did not realize you were carrying. Gradually, certainty begins to soften. This process can feel deeply unsettling because our identities are built from countless interconnected beliefs. Altering one important belief often forces us to reconsider many others. That emotional cost explains why people sometimes avoid difficult questions altogether. Avoidance protects psychological stability, even if it limits intellectual growth. Consider what happens when two people read exactly the same evidence. One approaches the material believing that miracles are by definition impossible because nature always operates according to consistent physical laws. The other approaches believing that if a creator exists, extraordinary interventions are at least possible. Notice that neither assumption comes directly from the evidence itself. Each person arrives carrying philosophical commitments that shape interpretation before the first archaeological report is even opened. Evidence never speaks in complete isolation. Human beings interpret evidence through broader worldviews. Recognizing this does not mean evidence becomes meaningless. It means intellectual honesty requires acknowledging the lenses through which we examine it. One of the most overlooked questions surrounding the Exodus concerns chronology. Scholars disagree about when such events, if historical, might have occurred. Different proposed dates interact differently with Egyptian history, archaeological findings, settlement patterns, and ancient inscriptions. Some researchers argue that existing evidence creates serious difficulties for a straightforward historical reconstruction. Others contend that gaps in the archaeological record leave room for possibilities that cannot yet be ruled out. Still, others suggest that the biblical account may preserve memories of real historical experiences that were later shaped into the theological narrative found in the text. These positions are not interchangeable, and each relies on different interpretations of the available evidence. The existence of disagreement should not surprise us. It reflects the reality that reconstructing ancient history often involves piecing together incomplete fragments rather than assembling a finished puzzle. There is also a tendency to misunderstand what archaeology can actually accomplish. Archaeology rarely proves events with mathematical certainty. More often, it identifies patterns, cultures, settlements, trade routes, inscriptions, destruction layers, environmental changes, and material remains that help historians evaluate competing hypotheses. Silence in the archaeological record is not always decisive because preservation is uneven. Entire ancient cities remain undiscovered. Organic materials decay. Coastlines move. Human construction destroys earlier evidence. At the same time, archaeology can sometimes challenge traditional assumptions by failing to support expected patterns or by uncovering information that complicates long-held interpretations. The discipline is valuable precisely because it refuses to let anyone become too comfortable with simplistic answers. This should encourage humility rather than frustration. Another reason the story resonates so deeply is that it mirrors an experience almost everyone recognizes. At some point, every person reaches what feels like an impossible barrier. Whether that barrier is grief, failure, addiction, financial collapse, illness, loneliness, or overwhelming uncertainty, life eventually presents moments that seem impassable. The image of trapped people standing between danger and an uncrossable body of water speaks to something universal. Even readers who interpret the account primarily through theology or symbolism often find profound meaning in that image because it reflects a recurring human experience. Symbolic significance, however, is not necessarily a statement about historical certainty. Confusing those categories creates unnecessary conflict. Something can possess enduring symbolic power, regardless of ongoing historical investigation. Likewise, believing a narrative has historical foundations does not require ignoring literary artistry or theological purpose. The ancient authors themselves often communicated on multiple levels simultaneously. Modern readers sometimes insist on reducing every text to only one category, when the text itself may resist such reduction. There is another uncomfortable observation hiding beneath this conversation. People often demand extraordinary standards of evidence only for claims they already doubt, while accepting surprisingly weak evidence for claims they already favor. This inconsistency appears everywhere, not only in religious discussions. We tend to scrutinize opposing ideas more aggressively than our own. Psychologists have documented this tendency repeatedly. The mind naturally protects existing beliefs because consistency feels safer than revision. Recognizing this bias is difficult because the bias itself convinces us that we are being objective. Everyone believes they are simply following the evidence. Far fewer people ask whether they are applying the same standards consistently across every topic. That question is uncomfortable because it threatens our self-image as rational thinkers. History repeatedly reminds us that intelligent people can sincerely disagree without either side being irrational. The existence of disagreement does not automatically mean truth is unknowable. It means evidence must be weighed carefully and conclusions held with appropriate confidence. Some questions deserve strong confidence because evidence is overwhelming. Others deserve cautious probability. Others remain genuinely unresolved. Wisdom often consists of distinguishing between these categories, instead of pretending every issue belongs in the same one. When conversations about Moses become emotionally charged, it is often because participants are defending much more than a single historical event. They are defending entire worldviews. For one person, questioning the crossing feels like questioning the trustworthiness of Scripture as a whole. For another, accepting the possibility of miraculous intervention feels like abandoning an understanding of reality built on natural explanations. These broader concerns explain why discussions that begin with archaeology quickly expand into philosophy, theology, epistemology, and personal identity. Beneath every historical question lies another question about how we know what we know. That deeper question is ultimately more difficult than locating an ancient shoreline. Perhaps the greatest challenge is learning to separate confidence from curiosity. Confidence provides stability, but curiosity keeps us honest. Without confidence, we become incapable of making decisions. Without curiosity, we stop learning. Mature thinking requires holding both together. It allows us to recognize the strengths and limitations of our conclusions without pretending uncertainty is failure. The world often rewards loud certainty because it sounds persuasive. Reality is rarely obligated to reward certainty with accuracy. Sometimes the strongest position is not the one that claims to possess every answer. Sometimes it is the one that continues asking careful questions while remaining willing to revise its understanding if better evidence emerges. That posture demands patience, humility, and courage because it requires admitting that our minds, however intelligent, remain limited. In the end, perhaps the enduring power of the Red Sea story lies not only in what it says about the past, but in what it reveals about the present. It exposes our longing for certainty, our fear of ambiguity, our dependence on community, our tendency toward confirmation bias, and our struggle to distinguish inherited belief from personally examined conviction. Those psychological realities remain with us whether we ultimately conclude that the crossing occurred exactly as described, that it reflects extraordinary natural events interpreted through theological meaning, or that it belongs primarily to sacred narrative. Before reaching any conclusion, the most valuable question may not be whether the waters parted, but whether we have allowed our own assumptions to remain unexamined for far too long. Imagine that somehow you could stand on the shoreline thousands of years ago without bringing any of your modern assumptions with you. You would not know the outcome of the story. You would not know what later generations would write. You would not know what historians, archaeologists, theologians, skeptics, or believers would eventually argue. You would simply be another human being trying to understand what was happening in front of your eyes. That thought experiment matters because hindsight gives us an illusion of certainty. We often forget that the people living through history never experience history the way later generations read about it. They experience confusion, fear, incomplete information, rumors, conflicting reports, and imperfect memory. Every historical event that later appears neat and organized was once messy and uncertain to the people living inside it. The farther we move from that reality, the easier it becomes to mistake simplified narratives for the complexity of real life. That realization should make us slower to dismiss and slower to declare certainty. It should remind us that history is rarely experienced as history while it is happening. It is simply life unfolding in real time. One reason the Exodus narrative has endured for so long is that it captures something profoundly human that extends beyond debates over historical reconstruction. Every generation eventually discovers that there are moments when the future disappears. The path behind is blocked. The path ahead cannot yet be seen. Whether those moments involve illness, grief, betrayal, financial collapse, war, displacement, or personal failure, they create the same emotional landscape described in countless ancient stories. Human beings have always searched for meaning in moments where reason alone seems insufficient to explain their experience. That does not answer whether the sea literally parted. It explains why stories like this continue to resonate, even among people who disagree about their historical foundations. They reflect psychological realities that remain familiar because human nature changes much more slowly than technology. Our fears, hopes, loyalties, and uncertainties are remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. Perhaps the greatest misconception surrounding debates like this is the belief that questioning a story automatically destroys its value, or that believing a story automatically settles every historical question. Reality is more nuanced. Serious scholars who are committed religious believers continue to investigate difficult historical questions without assuming that inquiry is the enemy of faith. Likewise, many non-religious historians acknowledge the enormous cultural, literary, and historical significance of biblical texts, even while remaining unconvinced by particular supernatural claims. The public conversation often presents only the loudest extremes because extremes attract attention. Quiet intellectual honesty rarely becomes viral. Yet genuine understanding usually grows in quieter places where people are willing to distinguish carefully between evidence, interpretation, philosophy, and personal conviction. That distinction requires patience, something increasingly rare in a culture that rewards immediate certainty. Social media encourages instant opinions. Ancient history demands slow thinking. Those two habits are fundamentally incompatible. The more emotionally invested we become in proving our side correct, the less likely we are to notice evidence that complicates our position. This is why intellectual humility is not the opposite of conviction. It is what protects conviction from becoming dogmatism. Humility allows us to say that some conclusions are well supported, others remain probable, and others are still open to debate. It accepts that not every unanswered question represents failure. Some questions remain open simply because the surviving evidence is limited. There is dignity in admitting the limits of our knowledge. In fact, recognizing those limits is often the beginning of wisdom rather than the end of it. Throughout history, countless discoveries have challenged assumptions that once seemed unquestionable. Entire civilizations disappeared beneath sand until archaeology uncovered them. Ancient inscriptions transformed historians' understanding of forgotten kingdoms. At the same time, many cherished theories collapsed when new evidence appeared. This pattern teaches an important lesson. History is not static. It is an ongoing conversation between surviving evidence and careful interpretation. That conversation will likely continue regarding the Exodus for generations to come. New discoveries may illuminate certain questions while leaving others unresolved. Anyone who promises absolute finality on every aspect of such an ancient event is promising more than history itself can reasonably deliver. Yet uncertainty should not discourage investigation. On the contrary, Uncertainty is precisely what makes investigation worthwhile. Questions that already have obvious answers rarely produce meaningful discoveries. The most valuable conversations are often the ones that force us to confront our own assumptions. Whether someone ultimately concludes that the crossing was a miraculous historical event, a historical memory expressed through theological storytelling, an account shaped by extraordinary natural phenomena, or something else entirely, the process of reaching that conclusion matters. If the conclusion emerges from careful examination rather than inherited certainty, something valuable has already been gained. Independent thought is not measured by which conclusion you reach. It is measured by your willingness to examine why you reached it. That is far more difficult than simply defending the beliefs you already possess. Human beings naturally seek belonging. Belonging is one of our deepest psychological needs. Communities provide identity, security, and meaning. But belonging also creates subtle pressure to protect shared narratives. Few people enjoy becoming outsiders within the groups they love. That pressure exists in religious communities, academic communities, political movements, and virtually every social environment. The fear of social rejection often influences belief more than evidence does. We rarely notice this because belonging feels normal until it is threatened. The possibility of standing alone with an unpopular conclusion is emotionally expensive. This is why genuine intellectual courage is uncommon. It asks us to value truth more than comfort, without becoming arrogant or dismissive toward those who disagree. Courage without humility becomes pride. Humility without courage becomes silence. Thoughtful inquiry requires both. The story of Moses at the sea therefore challenges more than historical curiosity. It challenges our relationship with uncertainty itself. Are we willing to admit when we do not know? Are we willing to distinguish between confidence and evidence? Are we willing to recognize that sincere people can disagree while examining many of the same facts? Are we willing to question ideas that have become intertwined with our identities? Those questions extend far beyond religion. They shape how we approach every important issue in life. The habit of asking careful questions may be one of the most valuable intellectual disciplines a person can develop. It slows impulsive judgment. It exposes hidden assumptions. It creates space for learning. Most importantly, it reminds us that reality is under no obligation to conform to our expectations. Whether the waters parted through direct divine intervention, whether an extraordinary natural event later became the foundation of a theological narrative, or whether the account should primarily be understood in another way, remains a subject of continuing discussion among scholars from different disciplines and philosophical perspectives. That ongoing debate is not evidence that the question is unimportant. Quite the opposite. It is evidence that the question touches something fundamental about how human beings understand history, meaning, and truth. The longer you reflect on it, the more you realize that the real journey is not simply toward an answer about an ancient sea. It is toward a deeper understanding of how your own mind works when confronted with uncertainty. In the end, perhaps the most enduring lesson is surprisingly simple. Familiarity is not proof. Confidence is not evidence. Doubt is not defeat. Curiosity is not betrayal. Honest questions are not enemies of truth. They are often the path that leads us closer to it. And whatever conclusion you eventually reach about Moses and the sea, let it be a conclusion you arrived at because you examined the evidence, understood the different perspectives, recognized your own biases, and remained willing to follow the search wherever it honestly led. If that kind of careful thinking resonates with you, stay with this conversation, because the most important questions are rarely the ones that offer the fastest answers, but the ones that continue shaping the way we seek truth long after the discussion ends.